You know the old song, the times they are a-changin', and on this episode of the Flophouse Files, they sure did for the barely existing subgenre known as car combat. A bunch of vehicles firing in all directions with the last car still running being crowned the winner. The advent of new-fangled 3D consoles like the PlayStation, coupled with Sony Computer Entertainment's louder, more in-your-face marketing campaign, a sudden glut of games took the wholesome tradition of the leisurely Sunday drive into
Sweet Tooth is back in Twisted Metal 3 with enough weapons to make any angry driver happy.
This came to a head in 1995 with Singletrack's Twisted Metal. Now, it wasn't just a racer with a flashy name. In fact, it wasn't a racer at all, but it made an impact as it went on to birth a whole new type of game. Well, not really. But why did this all happen? Why did such a hot new idea crash and burn so fast? And where are car combat games nowadays? Well, it's a complex story filled with spills, chills, and thrills. This is the case of the vanishing vehicular violence. Now, the idea of strapping weapons onto cars didn't start with Twisted Metal, because in previous generations, you could use a whole arsenal in rock and roll racing, working someone over with a pool cue in Road Rash, or of course, exploding Limburger in Biker Mice from Mars. That aside, there was always a racing element to said games, but when Destruction Derby released in October of 1995 on the PlayStation and PC, it emphasized, don't be shocked, destruction, in lieu of beating opponents to the checkered flag. But just 1 month later, Twisted Metal would also hit the PlayStation and took this idea even further, essentially presenting a fighting game. Over-the-top fantasy characters, dark moody backgrounds, a narrative focusing on a shady villain hosting a tournament, with all comers willing to do anything and everything to win. Twisted Metal was living life in the fast lane on Sony's new machine, selling well over 1 million copies, which of course had all other competitors racing to take that crown. You had things like Carmageddon, Vigilante 8, Interstate 76, Turn Signal 420, and many, many others. It seemed like this was going to be the hot new genre, like the first-person shooter was just a few years earlier. However, one major thing occurred that many gamers might not have been aware of. Behind the scenes, Twisted Metal was caught in between a custody battle between Singletrack, the developer of the series, and Sony Computer Entertainment, the publisher. Once Twisted Metal 2 released and was an even bigger smash, as well as delivering another hit with the Jet Moto series, Singletrack accused Sony of withholding payments they were owed due to the game's phenomenal success. Sony disagreed, and the two companies parted ways. Since the franchise was owned by the publishing giant, however, they instead pushed forward with both Twisted Metal 3 and 4 with their own internal studio, 989 at the helm. The reception to these two sequels wasn't especially enthusiastic, with two factors working against them. 989 were not given much time to develop either game, and were also not given access to any assets or code from Twisted Metal 1 and 2, something Singletrack wholly owned, leaving 989 at a distinct disadvantage in trying to emulate the look and feel of the franchise. During all this, car combat clones kept coming out, and those clones were even getting their own sequels, while Singletrack decided to start all over again and shacked up with GT Interactive for a multi-game deal. First was Critical Depth, an underwater take on Twisted Metal, which garnered average reviews, so they therefore immediately followed up that with Rogue Trip Vacation 2012, which even had a loud and proud "from the creators of Twisted Metal" sticker right on the jewel case, which only mystified ignorant players who had no idea of the split between Sony and Singletrack. While Rogue Trip certainly tried some new things within the genre, its name and the weaker marketing reach of GT Interactive resulted in the game being largely ignored by the public, not even approaching the sales of the then current Twisted Metals. Singletrack then hit hard times, baby, before one final dying fart escaped their asses, that being Animorphs. They closed their doors in 2000. Twisted Metal 3 and 4, however, while still selling quite well, was on a downward downward trend, and in 2001, 989 had the franchise taken away from them, with the keys being handed to some familiar faces. Incognito Entertainment was formed by former members of SingleTrack around 1999, after the completion of Road Trip, and made a deal with Sony to continue twisting the metal with two distinct games in 2001. The first being something maybe nobody wanted: Twisted Metal Small Brawl, a more kid-friendly spin on the source material for the PlayStation 1 for some reason. While Sony's aging console still had a big install base, why anyone thought this was a good idea is just, I don't know. It received, as you can expect, mixed reviews. That same year, they released the complete total opposite, this time on the PlayStation 2 with Twisted Metal Black. This was something of a reboot to the series, with a far darker, almost gothic aesthetic, eschewing the colorful roots of the series. This was also a homecoming for Twisted Metal creators David Jaffe and Scott Campbell, who hadn't touched the franchise since the second game. During those years off, between Twisted Metal 4 and Twisted Metal Black, no other franchise came up to fill the void, and by the time Black had come out, things were already on a downturn because 2001 was an important year just for something else. Car combat was fast being left in the dust for another marriage between vehicles and violence, that being the open world sandbox heralded by GTA 3. Luxoflux, makers of Vigilante 8, started off the millennium with 2000's forgettable Star Wars Demolition, but quickly made a hard left, ditching car combat altogether for true crime Streets of LA, just 2 years after Black had released. And by this time, the genre was already petering out with some licensed dreck that was slow on the uptake, but there's no need to name names here. WWE, crush heart!
The Undertaker now has control of the Twisty Rockets.
The Twisted Metal franchise, the bedrock of car combat, the Street Fighter of the genre, proved to be incredibly inconsistent, as it was a bit unclear of what direction Incognito or Sony wanted to take it. This couldn't be further exemplified by 2005's PSP exclusive Twisted Metal Head On, which ran back the rebooted universe established by Black and was instead considered a direct sequel to 2, ignoring the events of 3 and 4. This is a common practice nowadays, but might have been a touch confusing 14 years ago. Following Head On, however, in another baffling move, Incognito was planning to then make a sequel to Black, going back to that universe with Twisted Metal Harbor City. Work got underway, but then several prominent team members up and left the project mid-development. This effectively killed Incognito, the remaining staff joining David Jaffe at his new studio, Eat, Sleep, Play, which he founded after directing God of War. What's more confusing about all of this is that 3 years later, in 2008, a port of Head On was announced for the PlayStation 3, called Twisted Metal Head On Extra Twisted Edition. This version was handled by Eat, Sleep, Play, shoehorning in the levels that were initially made for Harbor City, and this must be a mistake. It says this was on the PS2, not the PS3, the console that had already been out for 3 years. Yes, for reasons I can't ascertain, Twisted Metal was again delegated to an older, less capable machine, while sandbox games were continually blowing up on next-gen machines. There were now only a handful of titles that were still standard bearers for the genre, things like Full Auto, Red Faction Battlegrounds, and Blood Drive, none of which were strong enough to carry things forward. That's not to say Sony wasn't pushing car-based games, they just weren't pushing Twisted Metal, but instead things like MotorStorm on the PS3. In fact, MotorStorm was so big at that time that its various sequels and spin-offs would wind up influencing or even outright canceling Twisted Metal pitches. One such version, pitched by Eat, Sleep, Play, was dubbed Twisted Metal Apocalypse, which, as you can imagine, revolved around a more end-of-the-world type scenario. However, MotorStorm Apocalypse put the kibosh on that, forcing Eat, Sleep, Play to go back to the proverbial drawing board. Twisted Metal Revolution was then pitched, which was a hip-hop urban flavored take on the franchise, which Sony passed on. We can consider this time frame to be similar to the dark ages of fighting games, as the mid to late 2000s were rough to a lot of established series and genres. Street Fighter releases had all but dried up, but a few remaining games were holding things down, things like Tekken, Mortal Kombat, and yeah, even Dead or Alive. But unlike fighting games, car combat lacked these strong contenders. It took until 2012 for the franchise to finally make its return with Twisted Metal, another reboot, this time with David Jaffe at the wheel. This game, however, had its own unique set of problems. It was originally pitched and greenlit as a digital-only multiplayer-focused budget title until Sony marketing asked for single-player content to be added, even though it was initially in the plan. Following that, the game suddenly switched from a smaller digital-only release to a full-boxed game, something that again, Eat Sleep Play hadn't prepared for. They were a very small company, so with slapdash story content added in, a limited roster of characters, and the generally smaller scale of everything, Twisted Metal failed to make any waves in the current marketplace, either in sales or reviews. Eat Sleep Play lingered on for a few more years, making smelly iOS time wasters until they closed in 2016, and thus marked the last game ever released under the Twisted Metal banner. This complete mishandling of this legendary franchise, the lack of worthy successors to the throne, and the advent and exploding popularity of sandbox games are all contributing factors to the death of car combat. That being said, there are still little specks of its DNA that live on. As odd as it first may seem, Rocket League takes those same concepts and does something wholly unique with them, but obviously in a far less violent way. Racing games themselves still have some combative elements, with games like Grip, Combat Racing, Gas Guzzlers, or the short-lived Onrush, but nothing like Twisted Metal survives to this day, and in fact, unless my files are incomplete, none of the developers who made car combat in the 90s and early 2000s still exist themselves, except maybe the developer of the Interstate franchise, which was, yeah, they're still alive, obviously. It's a case of too many games being released too quickly, glacial innovation, and the encroaching popularity of competitive genres. Even Twisted Metal itself, in its last bid to recapture its glory days, failed to do so. Maybe if it had been given the budget and time to make a better impression on the PS3, or was positioned to be a big Vita title, things could have been different. But sometimes you can't dwell on the past, and you need to look forward to the crater-filled, shell-casing-covered open highway of the future. And with that, the case of the vanishing vehicular violence is closed. Know of any other stories I can track down? Jot down some notes in the comments below, or head on over to the Flophouse VIP HQ to nominate a case file. Catch you next time, fellow gumshoes, on the Flophouse Files.